Hello, friends. Today we're going to be diving into info dumping and over explaining. We're going to look at how to avoid info dumping and especially how to fix it once you spot it in your writing, in your first draft, second draft, whatever draft you are currently at. Hopefully that sounds fun. I'm sorry if my voice is a little, I have a bit of a sore throat, but we will power through. So let's dive in. What info dumping even is, and why is that even a problem in storytelling? So, what we usually call info dumping, I'm using this very professional term, is whenever you're over explaining something, whenever you have a large chunk of either like a paragraph or a dialogue where it's practically even a monologue where you that is packed with information that overloads the audience and that just feels very explainy instead of kind of moving the story forward. In this description, we can already sense what the potential problems might be. So, the first problem is overloading the audience with information. That, of course, doesn't feel very nice when you are a part of the audience. It feels more like you're in a lecture. And especially, it feels like this big chunk of data that all of a sudden you have to memorize. And usually, when we are watching a movie or reading a novel, we're not there to memorize things with our, let's say, our brain part. It's more about experiencing the story, which brings us to the second problem, which is that info dumping is usually telling instead of showing. So it's really about trying to tell us the information in some sort of lectury, rational way, instead of letting us observe that and gather that information for ourselves and see things that are happening and deduce whatever is going on by ourselves, because that's, humans are capable of doing that, and we do that very naturally whenever we are listening to a story or reading a story or watching a story. And of course, the third problem that both of these combined create is that infodumping halts the momentum of the story. It really feels like we're lagging here because we need some time to learn all of this stuff. It's like, okay, there's a quick history lesson in the middle of a story, a journey, an experience. And now all of a sudden we have to memorize a bunch of things so that then we can continue with the story. But of course, it's actually very understandable that we as writers would resort to info dumping sometimes, especially in our first drafts, because often we do have a lot of information that we feel is essential to the story, and that it's essential for the audience to know all of this information and to have all of this information. Otherwise, they won't be able to follow the story. They won't be able to go on this journey. This refers to any genre, any format, any medium, but it might be interesting to note that it's especially common for sci-fi and fantasy, because of course there are things in there often that we don't know, we're not already familiar with. So there are elements of the world building that you have to explain in a way that you know the audience doesn't already know. Because if you're writing some sort of period drama, then you also have a lot of explaining to do, but you can count on the audience knowing a little bit about the context. And especially if you're writing a contemporary story, then you know that the audience is familiar with at least some of the context of the story, right? But whenever you're writing sci-fi or fantasy, there are going to be things that you will have to explain. And that's where over-explaining and info dumping can sneak in. And that's why we're going to look at Inception later on, because that's a really great example of doing exactly that. But as I've said, this is really, really common to all genres, especially when it comes to our first drafts, when we are introducing characters and their backstories and the history of whatever story we're about to witness. So, the main problem with info dumping is about the information that you want to give, to convey to your audience. So, let's look at two ways that you can be mindful and intentional about doing that in your writing. Sometimes just tell. Sometimes you just need to get it out of the way. What I mean by that is whenever you have something that is really, really important and you can try to make it as concise as possible, such as London 1583. Okay, if that is the setting of your story and you feel it's very important that the audience knows that that is the setting, you really can just say that. Just write it there, at the beginning of the chapter, right in the first frame of the movie. It's going to be right there, and then we don't need to fuss about with using some references from, England in the 16th century and blah, blah, blah. And you don't need to worry so much about conveying the period and the geographic location and like the cultural environment through behavior and costumes and the entire context. Of course, I'm not saying you should disregard that. That's all great. And it's going to be part of world building. My point is, you don't need to rely on that to tell this information because we are already going to have that information. This one doesn't refer only to the setting. You can do that with characters as well. For example, think of Guy Ritchie and the very typical way. Now I'm actually not thinking about Guy Ritchie, but I remembered a Psych episode that does the kind of parody or homage, depends on who you ask, of Guy Ritchie movies. And this typical introduction of characters where it's a little bit graphic, you see the character and then their name is written next to their face and usually also their profession or whatever they are doing, whatever their role is in the group, and also some quirky information about them. I just remembered, I think The Duff, it's a teen movie, also does something similar. But anyway, it's not, this is not exclusive to these movies. It's a known way of conveying information. It's very fast and very easy. It's a great way to introduce characters if that's something that you are struggling with. And of course, this will bring us to the next point, if it's aligned with the tone and the voice of the story. Because when it comes to just telling, that's usually easier for something very fast. Like, okay, this is Christina, she's the most popular girl in school, her favorite hobby is skiing. I don't know, right? and you can totally do that. But sometimes you do have more information than just a quick snippet. This is usually, of course, like we talked about in sci-fi or fantasy, when you want to explain a little bit more, or when you're introducing a character and you want to explain their backstory. So many things can come up, and you want to convey so many things. This is when it's really, really good to think about how can you upgrade this information and how can you integrate it into the story. So what I mean here is to really pay attention to how you do it. It's not just about the fact that, well, you have to tell the audience a lot about this character and their history. And sometimes you can't show that in a way that would, or you could show it, but that would take a whole separate movie by itself. Sometimes you kind of do just have to tell. And so in that case, find another role for this, let's call it quote unquote info dumping, so that you can infuse it with the tone and voice of the story that we're about to see. So that maybe you can add some humor, maybe you can add a visual style to it. That would be the case, for example, for the Guy Ritchie style introduction that we talked about. Because this is when you make learning information about characters or learning information about the world fun, basically, and it's part of the story itself. In other words, you make it interesting. So what you need to do is you need to upgrade the mere, information telling to make it interesting. And you can do that using tone, action, voice, humor, style, of course, visual style, musical style, whatever it is that will fit with the medium that you're working with and with the tone of your story in general. This is very important, and I would say this is the most important piece of advice when it comes to info dumping or over explaining or just conveying a lot of information. You need to find a way to give it another dimension. You need to find a way to give it another layer so that we as the audience are not just taking in information, but there's something else going on as well. And another great way to do that is to let a character give this information and not just, okay, a character is going to give this information, so then it's fine, but give this character some sort of relationship to what they're talking about. We will see this in Mean Girls, and we will also see this in Inception. And anywhere where you see successful conveying of information, I bet you can find this too. Because if a character is telling something about someone else or explaining about how something works, if this character also has some sort of, it can be the slightest opinion about it, the slightest emotional reaction to what they're saying, so that it's not just completely objective, completely blah 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 blah, A, B, C, D, whatever, then that will inevitably make it more interesting. And, ideally, that relationship to whatever the character is talking about is a part of the story. And that's the best way to integrate the info dumping into the story itself. Okay, so now let's take a look at the two examples that I've been talking about. We're going to look at the very, very first opening scene of Mean Girls, where Katie is kind of getting ready to go to school, is getting ready for her first day of school, and her parents are, giving her last minute instructions to do so. This might seem like we're nitpicking here, but I really think observing just this very short scene can be very valuable when it comes to learning about how to successfully convey information. And this is a case of the character themselves telling us about their own backstory, but you will see how much information is packed into this opening scene and how we're not bored at all, and just how effective this scene is. So we start with Katie's parents talking down to the camera, seemingly preparing their child to go to school for the first time. Then we find out that the child is actually the 16-year-old protagonist of the film. This already establishes the comedic tone of the movie and naturally makes us curious about what's going on because it's slightly unusual. So, Katie, as narrator, explains she has been homeschooled until now. Immediately, she goes, I know what you're thinking, homeschooled kids are freaks. As we see a couple of kids being a little bit quirky. Do you see how fast paced this is moving along? And this naturally makes us wonder what she is like and why she has been homeschooled and what's the whole deal, what's going on. So Katie explains that both her parents are research zoologists and they have spent the last 12 years in Africa until her mom got offered tenure at Northwestern University. However, that's not all that's going on. As she's saying this, we see a photo of her in shock. As she says, so then it was goodbye Africa. We see a photo of her waving goodbye to the camera. And as she says, and hello high school, we are now back in front of the high school Katie is about to go to. So just in these brief backstory introduction, we have gotten a really good sense of Katie's backstory and her emotional journey through like what brought her here to her first day in, let's say, actual high school. So not being homeschooled, but her first day in high school with other kids. So why does this short info dump, so this would not be info dump because it very clearly keeps up the momentum, but it's a very information packed chunk of story right there. And why does it work so well? Because it's fast paced, it's dynamic, it's full of humor, there's fun stuff going on. It lets us know what the tone of the movie will be. It lets us know what the backstory of the character is. It lets us know what the character feels about that. And we also get a sense of her own personality. So we can see how this opening scene was like not just conveying information, it was not just info dumping, but it was upgraded through style and humor and the tone and the character attitude, characters not indifference, but difference. So characters' emotional investment in what's going on. Through all of that, it was upgraded and it became this super fun and compelling opening scene that just makes you want to watch the entire movie. And if it doesn't, then you're not the target audience, and that's also fine. But I think even if that's not something that you would like, you can see how this is a very effective opening scene and a very effective way of conveying information about, what's going on, who the central character is, what kind of world we are entering right now. Now you might say, sure, that works for a teen comedy where you can totally go crazy with all the, fun and quirky jokes, but I can't do that if I'm writing a very serious movie or a very serious novel or whatever it is that you're working on. So that's why we're going to look at Inception. Now, if you are working on sci fi or fantasy, I think, or even in murder mysteries, that's the case. There are some genres where the audience is already interested in what you will have to explain, because that's kind of part of your target audience. Someone who is interested in sci-fi, in the sci-fi genre, is probably also going to be already a little bit interested in your explanation about how something works in your story. But still, of course, we can't fall on that. So we are still going to look at how you can upgrade that as well. And for that purpose, we're going to take a look at Inception, and especially the scenes where Cobb and later Arthur are explaining the whole mechanism of what they're doing to Ariadne. Now, first things first, I think it's good to notice how smart it is that here we don't just learn everything all at once, but we get this information is a little bit, it's not completely scattered throughout the entire story, but you can see that we get a little bit first, a little bit about the what's going on through Cobb telling Ariadne, and then later, because he wants to hire her as the architect, as the dream architect, later Arthur explains more to her as Cobb is going around the world and, gathering up his team. At first, when we have Cobb showing Ariadne how the dream world works, one thing that, of course, makes it much more interesting is that he is actively showing her. In this case, we as the audience are kind of on the same level as her, and as he's telling her about the principles of the dream world and what are the rules inside dreams, we are also simultaneously seeing that. And yes, here the benefit is that this is very interesting and very intriguing to see, because it's a pretty unique it's a pretty unique idea. But so yeah, here we don't have just a lecture about how this works and maybe like the physics of why it works, blah 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 blah. But we are going through the onboarding, the tutorial, the experience together with Ariadne. And now later, when Ariadne decides to join them, of course, now she has to learn more specifics about how to actually create these dream worlds. So now we have Arthur explaining to her. And now we can see this is getting a little bit okay, we kind of got it, and this could be very well boring, but there are two things that add more interest in it, and two things that upgrade this whole information conveying process. One thing is that now Ariadne starts to ask about Cobb and his wife, Mel. So we have this intertwining of, learning about the architecture of the dream world, which is still fascinating. It's, actually, even if it was just that, it wouldn't be boring. But even still, we have that. And at the same time, we have kind of another line of potential info dumping. So we're learning about the main character, Cobb, and his history, his backstory. So that is one thing that upgrades this whole process of quote unquote info dumping. And the other thing is that at the same time, we are also watching Cobb go around the world and, as I've said, collect his team, the rest of his team. And this really gives the whole scene more momentum, and we can see that at the same time the story is moving forward, and it's really just very masterfully done. So what is really, really well executed here is, first of all, the information is never just dumped, literally, info dumped on the audience, but it is scattered and organized throughout the scenes in a way that, first of all, allows us to process it better and also allows the rest of the story to move on and to breathe, to still keep the momentum of the plot going along, because we need that, especially in a story like Inception. We need to keep moving along. So that's something that you can think about. How can you infuse a little more action and a little more momentum into the very scene where you are doing the information conveying or info dumping? Or if you can't do it in that scene itself, can you mix it with something else that is going on at the same time that will still give us this feeling of, okay, we are moving along, we are going forward, we are still on this journey. Okay, so now that we have done all that blabbering about and all of those observations, let's see what are some practical tips that we can take from all of this that might help you avoid or fix or upgrade any kind of info dumping that you might encounter in your writing. First of all, whenever you have big blocks of information, think about how you could make it interesting. And you can do that via tone, style, humor, inserting character reactions, or inserting more action or emotions, or adding information about relationships to it. All of that, any of that, whatever it is that you can think of that would work in your story, join that, fuse that together with conveying information. That's how you can make it an organic part of the story. And of course, when you have big chunks of information, it's always worth asking if this could be scattered at least a little bit. It's not very common that you truly need to convey like a whole, encyclopedia of information in one moment, in 1 second. Think about how can you spread that through. It doesn't have to be throughout an entire first act. Just think about a few scenes instead of one scene with all the information dumped at once. Think about how can you spread that so that, again, it will be just easier for the audience to process that. Up next, you can always have one character explain things to another. That is classic for a reason, but take it a step further and don't make these characters indifferent towards the topic. If the character is conveying information, if the character is explaining something, can you just add a tiny little bit of emotion to it? Or a lot, depending on your story, of course. But, like, are they talking about this with awe? Are they talking about it with regret? Are they talking about it with sadness? Are they talking about it with pride? Maybe like when it's a scientist explaining, an invention that they came up with, or whatever it is. There are so many. Maybe they're explaining how it works with jealousy. Maybe it's a scientist explaining how some other scientist created something, and through their explaining, you can see that they're jealous of their success, or resentment or bitterness or frustration. Or of course it can also be through love or joy or whatever it is. There are so many options, but as soon as you just lean into, just add a little sprinkle of, emotional attitude towards what the character is talking about, it will automatically upgrade it and make it much more interesting in your story. The next tip would be to use the natural human curiosity. So, first, show us something cool or someone who is clearly relevant to the story. Let us wonder about it first. Let us get interested. That can be for a split millisecond. It doesn't have to be much. You can also, leave it up for a long time. But just as long as you spark our interest just a little bit and then answer our questions. And we'll be very happy about that. That is one of the reasons why all the info dumping scenes that are called, revealing who the murderer is in murder mysteries work so well. And usually you can notice that that scene is practically always info dumping. But we, as the audience, are very curious to hear who was the murderer. How are you going to explain everything that's been going on? Why was that person acting suspiciously? Why was that person acting suspiciously? And once you have us interested and asking questions, then you can explain away all you want. And we're going to be just happy to get the information. And lastly, if you can, place the info dumping into a context that is moving the story forward. Like perhaps the character needs to explain something within a certain time limit, or they're doing it on the way towards something, or whatever it is that you can think of that would make it so that we have some sort of context, that we're not just here, learning about stuff, but we do have the feeling that, okay, this is still going somewhere. And the explaining is not going to last forever. It's just something that we really need to learn at this point. In general, how we could sum all of this up is no matter what kind of information you're trying to convey, think about how you can add another layer to it, another dimension to it. This actually applies to not just info dumping, but storytelling in general. And when it comes to explaining, also, of course, keep in mind who your target audience is, because different audiences will have different tolerance for how much you are info dumping, how much you are explaining. Like I mentioned before, especially sci-fi fantasy, that's the audience that is usually more interested in learning more about the world. And or in murder mysteries, of course, at the end we will want to have our questions answered. But this is not exclusive to these genres. Just think about how much also information is the audience expecting from you, how much do they really need to know, how much are they perhaps going to enjoy knowing, and also use your own sensibility here. You can totally lean on that as well. You can trust that as well. And of course, think about whether you want to do it kind of short and concise and just get it out of the way, or if it's the type of information that you want to take a little more time with. And that's it. That's what I have for you today when it comes to info dumping. Thank you so much for being here. Hopefully, this has been useful in some way, or at least interesting. If so, let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.